Hello, and welcome to another episode of Unworthy History. Today we got some more actual history for you from this book right here, Narrative of My Captivity Among the Sioux Indians by Fanny Kelly. This book was published all the way back in 1871. So this is episode 3 in my series on Fanny Kelly, and in this episode, Fanny tells us about the beginning of her captivity. The facts related in the preceding chapter concerning matters occurring in Mr. Kelly's experience and adventures after the attack upon our train were related to me after my restoration to freedom and my husband by him. I now return to the narration of my own terrible experiences. I was led a short distance from the wagon with Mary and told to remain quiet, and I tried to submit. But oh, what a yearning sprang up in my heart to escape, as I hoped my husband had done. But many watchful eyes were upon me, and enemies on every side, and I realized that any effort then at escape would result in failure, and probably cause the death of all the prisoners. Mrs. Larimer with her boy came to us, trembling with fear, saying, "The men have all escaped, and left us to the mercy of the Indians." In reply, I said, "I do hope they have. What benefit would it be to us to have them here, to suffer this fear and danger with us? They would be killed, and then all hope of rescue for us would be at an end." Her agitation was extreme. Her grief seemed to have reached its climax when she saw the Indians destroying her property, which consisted principally of such articles as belonged to the daguerrean art. She had indulged in high hopes of fortune from the prosecution of this art among the mining towns of Idaho. As she saw her chemicals, picture cases, and other property pertaining to her calling being destroyed, she uttered such a wild, despairing cry as brought the chief of the band to us, who, with gleaming knife, threatened to end all her further troubles in this world. The moment was a critical one for her. The Indians were flushed with an easy-won victory over a weak party. They had tasted blood, and it needed but slight provocation for them to shed that even of defenseless women and children. My own agony could be no less than that of my companion in misfortune. The loss of our worldly possessions, which were not inconsiderable, consisting of a large herd of cattle and groceries and goods of particular value in the mining regions, I gave no thought to. The possible fate of my husband, the dark, fearful future that loomed before myself and little Mary, for whose possible future I had more apprehension than for my own, were thoughts flashed through my mind to the exclusion of all mere pecuniary considerations. But my poor companion was in great danger, and perhaps it was a selfish thought of future loneliness and captivity which induced me to intercede that her life might be spared. I went to the side of the chief, and assuming a cheerfulness I was very far from feeling, pled successfully for her life. I endeavored in every way to propitiate our captors, but received no evidence of kindness or relenting that I could then understand. He did present me, however, a wreath of gay feathers from his own head, which I took, regarding it merely as an ornament, when in reality, as I afterward learned, it was a token of his favor and protection. He then left us to secure his own share of plunder, but we saw that we were surrounded by a special guard of armed men, and so gave up all struggle against what seemed an inevitable doom, and sat down upon the ground in despair. I know now that night had come upon us while we sat there, and that darkness was closing the scene of desolation and death before their arrangements for departure were completed. The first intimation we had that our immediate massacre was not intended was a few articles of clothing presented by a young Indian, whose name was Wakela, who intimated that we would have need for them. It was a pitiable sight to see the terrified looks of our helpless children, who clung to us for the protection we could not give. Mrs. Larimer was unconscious of the death of any of our party. I did not tell her what my eyes had seen, fearing that she could not endure it, but strove to encourage and enliven her, lest her excitement would hasten her death, or excite the anger of our captors. We both feared that when the Indians made their arrangements for departure, we would be quickly disposed of by the scalping knife. Or even should we escape for the time, we saw no prospect of release from bondage. Terror of the most appalling nature for the fate of the children possessed me, and all the horrors of Indian captivity that we had ever heard crowded on our minds with a new and fearful meaning. The slow fires, the pitiless knife, the poisoned arrows, the torture of famine, and 1,000 nameless phantoms of agony passed before our troubled souls, filling us with fears so harrowing that the pangs of dissolution compared to them must have been relief. It may be thought almost impossible in such a chaos of dread to collect the soul in prayer, but when woe is come, the soul is dumb that crieth not to God. And the only respite we could claim from despair was the lifting of our trembling hearts upward to the God of mercy. Those hours of misery can never be forgotten. We were oppressed by terrors we could not explain or realize. The sudden separation from those we loved and relied on, our own helplessness, and the gloom of uncertainty that hung over the future. Surely none can better testify to the worth of trust in God than those whose hope on earth seemed ended. And faint and weak as our faith was, it saved us from utter desolation and the blackness of despair. From among the confused mass of material of all kinds scattered about, the same young Indian, Wakela, brought me a pair of shoes, also a pair of little Mary's. He looked kindly as he laid these articles before me, intimating by his gestures that our lives were to be spared, and that we should have need of them and our other clothing during our long march into captivity. He also brought me some books and letters, all of which I thankfully received. I readily conceived a plan to make good use of them, and secreted as many as I could about my clothing. I said to Mrs. Larimer, "If I can retain these papers and letters, and we are forced to travel with the Indians into their unknown country, I shall drop them at intervals along the way we are taken as a guide, and trust in God that our friends may find and follow them to our rescue. Or if an opportunity of escape offers, we will seize it, and by their help retrace our steps." The property that the Indians could not carry with them they gathered into a pile and lighted. The light of the flame showed us the forms of our captors busily loading their horses and ours with plunder, and preparing to depart. When their arrangements were completed, they came to us and signified that we must accompany them, pointing to the horses they led up to us, and motioning for us to mount. The horse assigned to me was one that had belonged to Mr. Larimer, and was crippled in the back. This I endeavored to make them understand, but failed. Many persons have since assured me that, to them, death would have been preferable to life with such prospects, saying that rather than have submitted to be carried away by Indians to a dark and doubtful doom, they would have taken their own lives. But it is only those who have looked over the dark abyss of death who know how the soul shrinks from meeting the unknown future. Experience is a grand teacher, and we were then in her school, and learn that while hope offers the faintest token of refuge, we pause upon the fearful brink of eternity, and look back for rescue. Mrs. Larimer had climbed into her saddle, her boy placed behind her on the same horse, and started on, accompanied by a party of Indians. I also climbed into my saddle, but was no sooner there than the horse fell to the ground, and I under him, thus increasing the bruises I had already received, and causing me great pain. This accident detained me some time in the rear. A dread of being separated from the only white woman in that awful wilderness filled me with horror. Soon they had another horse saddled for me and assisted me to mount him. I looked around for my little Mary. There she stood, a poor helpless lamb, in the midst of bloodthirsty Indians. I stretched out my arms for her imploringly. For a moment they hesitated. Then, to my unspeakable joy, they yielded, and gave me my child. They then started on, leading my horse. They also gave me a rope that was fastened around the horse's underjaw. The air was cool, and the sky was bright with glitter of starlight. The water, as it fell over the rocks in the distance, came to our eager ears with a faint, pleasant murmur. All nature seemed peaceful and pitiless in its calm repose, unconscious of our desolate misery. The cry of night birds and chirp of insects came with painful distinctness as we turned to leave the valley of Little Box Elder. Straining my eyes, I sought to penetrate the shadows of the woods, where our fugitive friends might be hid. The smoldering ruins of our property fell into ashes, and the smoke faded away. Night had covered the traces of confusion and struggle with her shrouding mantle, and there seemed to be a quiet and unbroken peace. I turned for a last look, and even the smoke was gone. The solemn trees, the rippling water, the soft night wind, and the starlight told no tale of the desolation and death that had gone before. And I rode on in my helpless condition, with my child clinging to me, without guide or support save my trust in God. The Indians left the scene of their cruel rapacity, traveling northward, chanting their monotonous war song. After a ride of 2 miles through tall weeds and bushes, we left the bottomlands and ascended some bluffs, and soon after came to a creek which was easily forded, and where the Indians quenched their thirst. The hills beyond began to be more difficult to ascend, and the gorges seemed fearfully deep as we looked into the black shadows unrelieved by the feeble light of the stars. In the darkness of our ride, I conceived of a plan for the escape of little Mary. I whispered in her childish ear, "Mary, we are only a few miles from our camp, and the stream we have crossed you can easily wade through. I have dropped letters on the way, as you know, to guide our friends in the direction we have taken. They will guide you back again, and it may be your only chance of escape from destruction. Drop gently down and lie on the ground for a little while to avoid being seen. Then retrace your steps, and may God and mercy go with you. If I can, I will follow you." The child, whose judgment was remarkable for her age, readily acceded to this plan. Her eye brightened and her young heart throbbed as she thought of its success. Watching the opportunity, I dropped her gently, carefully, and unobserved to the ground, and she lay there while the Indians pursued their way, unconscious of their loss. To portray my feelings upon this separation would be impossible. The agony I suffered was indescribable. I was firmly convinced that my course was wise, that I had given her the only chance of escape within my power. Yet the terrible uncertainty of what her fate might be in the way before her was almost unbearable. I continued to think of it so deeply that at last I grew desperate and resolved to follow her at every risk. Accordingly, watching an opportunity, I too slipped on the ground under the friendly cover of the night, and the horse went on without its rider. However, my plan was not successful. My flight was soon discovered, and the Indian wheeled around and rode back in my pursuit. Crouching in the undergrowth, I might have escaped in the darkness, were it not for their cunning. Forming in a line of 40 or 50 abreast, they actually covered the ground as they rode past me. The horses themselves were thus led to betray me, for being frightened at my crouching form, they stopped and reared, thus informing them of my hiding place. With great presence of mind, I arose the moment I found myself discovered, and relating my story, the invention of an instant, I succeeded partially in allaying their anger. I told them that the child had fallen asleep and dropped from the horse, that I had endeavored to call their attention to it, but in vain, and fearing I would be unable to find her if we rode further, I had jumped down and attempted the search alone. The Indians used great violence toward me, assuring me that if any further attempts were made to escape, my punishment would be accordingly. They then promised to send a party out in search of the child when it became light. Poor little Mary, alone in the wilderness, a little helpless child. Who can portray her terror? With faith to trust and courage to dare, that little trembling form through the long hours of the night kept watch. The lonely cry of the night bird had no fear in its melancholy scream for the little wanderer, who crouched amid the prairie grass. The baying of the gray wolf as he passed the lonely watcher might startle, but could not drive the faith from her heart. Surely God is just, and angels will guide her faltering feet to friends and home. Innocent of wrong, how could she but trust that the unseen hands of spirits would guide her from the surrounding perils? So that's it for this episode. Here Fanny made the decision to send her young daughter to try to escape on her own in the wilderness, and Fanny's attempted escape failed. So we'll see what happens next to her in the next episode in this series as she's taken into captivity with the Sioux Indians. If you are interested in supporting Unworthy History, then you can check out our merch store. We just added some new hats and shirts. I just ordered this hat and I will be wearing it in a future episode. So if you want to see more episodes like this, then be sure to like and subscribe. And we'll see you next time on Unworthy History.